Aachen, October 1944. The thousand-year Reich is contracting with violent, shuddering gasps, its borders bleeding into the pulverized rubble of its own frontier cities. For a veteran Obergefreiter huddled in the freezing basement of a ruined textile factory, the war has undergone a terrifying metamorphosis. It is no longer about the vast, sweeping horizons of the Ukrainian steppe or the rolling pastoral fields of France where a man could see his enemy coming from a kilometer away. It is now a war of inches, of oppressive shadows, and of a terrifying rhythmic sound that the German infantry has come to call the death rattle. He hears the heavy, oily slide of a metallic bolt cycle in the absolute darkness of the corridor just beyond his door. He knows in his marrow that his bolt-action rifle, a masterpiece of 19th century Prussian precision and long-range lethality, is effectively a death sentence in this 20th century urban ruin. He is waiting for a duel of marksmanship, but his opponent is bringing a trench broom designed for the industrial-scale erasure of human life. Why did the battle-hardened veterans of the Wehrmacht, men who had survived the frozen horrors of Stalingrad and the burning sands of Tunisia, grow to hate the American Thompson more than any other weapon in the Allied arsenal? It wasn't merely the terrifying rate of fire or the legendary drum magazines of Hollywood myth. It was a cold, mechanical reality of urban survival that systematically dismantled their own doctrine, turning their legendary discipline into a liability.
To understand the specific, paralyzing dread that Thompson inspired, we must first analyze the fundamental tactical crisis of the German infantrymen in the final year of the war. For half a decade, the Wehrmacht had been the undisputed masters of the war of movement. Their entire tactical structure was built around the Gruppe, or squad, which functioned not as a collection of individual riflemen, but as a support element for a single, high-output machine gun, usually the bipod-mounted MG-34 or MG-42. In the open terrain of Russia, this was a winning formula. The infantrymen would provide security and precision shots with their bolt-action Kar 98K rifles, while the buzzsaw suppressed the enemy at long range. But as the Allied juggernaut reached the German frontier, the very nature of the terrain underwent a violent and claustrophobic transformation. The war entered the stone hell of the European city. In the shattered ruins of Aachen, Metz, and eventually Berlin, the vast distances that favored the German machine gun vanished. Combat was no longer measured in hundreds of meters across a valley. It was measured in the width of a hallway, the depth of a closet, or the height of a single debris-strewn staircase. The Kar 98K, while exceptionally accurate and possessing immense stopping power at 500 meters, was nearly 5 feet long with its bayonet attached. In the cramped confines of a basement apartment or a narrow sewer line, it was a clumsy, lethal liability. It required the soldier to manually cycle the bolt after every single shot, a physical, mechanical process that took nearly 2 seconds and required the soldier to momentarily break his sight picture and shift his grip. In an environment where the first person to pull the trigger usually won the right to survive the next 10 seconds, the German infantryman found himself carrying a weapon designed for the Napoleonic-era line of battle into a fight that demanded the gangster tactics of the American underworld. Opposing them were the Americans, and specifically the lead elements of the city fighters. To the German perspective, the American infantry was a paradox of contradictions. They were often viewed by German officers as over-equipped and logistically spoiled, yet in the ruins they displayed a brutal, efficient aggression that bordered on the fanatical. Central to this aggression was the Thompson Submachine Gun, often referred to by the GIs as the Tommy gun, or more ominously for the defenders, the Chicago typewriter. The Thompson was not just a submachine gun, it was a physical manifestation of American industrial philosophy. Heavy, over-engineered and relentless. While the German MP-40 was a refined, stamped steel tool firing the relatively light 9mm round, the Thompson was a heavy, milled steel beast chambered in the massive .45 ACP. It was designed to do one thing with absolute certainty: deliver massive kinetic shock at close range. To the German soldier, the Thompson represented a total abandonment of soldierly precision in favor of industrial-scale annihilation. In the German tactical manuals of the time, the Nahkampf, or close combat, was supposed to be a matter of well-placed grenades and the cold steel of a bayonet, but the Americans armed with Thompsons ignored the manual entirely. They didn't wait for a bayonet duel or a test of wills. They would round a corner and wash an entire room with a .45 caliber Hurricane before the German defender could even identify a target. The German soldiers began to refer to Thompson-equipped units as the butcher's detail, realizing that their years of training in the carabiner were rendered obsolete when their opponent could put 20 heavy rounds into a room in the time a German cycled his bolt once.
In the shattered suburbs and industrial zones of the Rhineland, the German infantry had to confront a terrifying technical reality. Their own submachine gun, the legendary MP-40, was being systematically outclassed in the specific theater of the Stone Hell. To the Lanzer, the MP-40 was a weapon of finesse. It had a relatively slow, controllable rate of fire, about 500 rounds per minute, which allowed for accurate bursts. It was light and easy to handle. But the Thompson was not built for finesse. It was built for the physics of the stopping event. The Thompson M1A1 fired at nearly 700 rounds per minute, but the dry numbers don't capture the psychological weight of that fire. Because the Thompson was heavy, weighing nearly 10 pounds when fully loaded, it was exceptionally stable during rapid fire. While the lighter MP-40 would climb and walk off target if the trigger was held down, the Thompson's mass absorbed the recoil of the heavy .45 slugs, allowing a GI to hold the weapon relatively steady. It turned a narrow corridor into a solid wall of lead. To a German soldier hiding behind a wooden door or a thin lath and plaster wall, the Thompson was a death sentence that ignored the concept of cover. The heavy, slow-moving .45 rounds didn't just impact a surface, they chewed through the urban landscape, pulverizing brick and splintering timber. The Americans didn't aim like soldiers, they sprayed like laborers clearing a workspace, wrote one German veteran of the 246th Volksgrenadier Division. At first, we laughed at their lack of discipline. We thought their reliance on automatic fire was a sign of cowardice. But in the basements of Aachen, we stopped laughing. The Americans would enter a building and simply empty their magazines into every dark corner and every shadow. If you were in that shadow, it didn't matter how many medals you had won on the Eastern Front. You were simply erased by the volume of metal. This gangster reputation was a profound psychological burden. Nazi propaganda tried to paint the Thompson as a weapon of the undisciplined American criminal, but on the ground, that reputation became a source of pervasive dread. The sound of the Thompson, the heavy, metallic clack, 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 became synonymous with a type of fighting that lacked honor but possessed total lethality. It was the sound of a weapon that didn't care about the rules of engagement, it only cared about the physics of impact. Furthermore, the Thompson's logistical presence was a display of obscene wealth. While the German MP-40 used a 32-round magazine that was notoriously prone to jamming if the soldier used it as a handhold, the Thompson was a tank of a weapon. It was a milled steel beast that could be dropped in the rubble, kicked through the mud, and still cycle perfectly. To the German soldier, whose own equipment was becoming increasingly scarce and of lower manufacturing quality, the sight of an American GI carrying 6 or 7 spare 30-round magazines was a crushing reminder of their inevitable defeat. In the stone hell, the American advantage was one of time to target. The Thompson allowed the GI to bypass the aiming phase of combat and move straight to the saturation phase. The result was tactical paralysis. German units began to fear the Thompson sweep, knowing that if an American assault team reached the threshold of a house, the battle for that house was already over. The fear was so pervasive that German units began to prioritize the capture of Thompsons for their own use, desperately hunting for .45 ammunition in the pockets of the American dead just to have a trench broom of their own. To the German grenadier defending the shattered remains of cities like Metz or Düren, the soundscape of the battlefield had become a source of constant analytical terror. They had learned to survive the distant thunder of Allied artillery and the high-pitched whistle of mortars, but inside the skeletal remains of apartment blocks, the most dreaded sound was the death rattle, the low, heavy, and incredibly rapid cadence of the Thompson. In the hollowed-out shells of European cities, where sound bounced off granite and concrete, the Thompson didn't just fire, it announced a presence that the German infantry felt they could not physically or psychologically counter. The fear was rooted in the clinical, gruesome reality of stopping power. In the open fields of the East, a soldier hit by a rifle round might have the adrenaline to crawl to safety or even return fire. But in the 4-meter-wide confines of a German parlor, the .45 ACP round acted with the finality of a sledgehammer. While the German 9mm bullet relied on velocity to penetrate, the Thompson used a massive 230-grain lead slug that relied on pure kinetic transfer. It was the difference between a needle and a brick. To the German soldier, the result was a visceral, terrifying spectacle that stayed with survivors for decades. After-action reports described the horror of seeing comrades hit by Thompson fire. They noted that the heavy .45 caliber rounds didn't just create wounds, they shattered the human frame. If a German soldier was hit in the limb by a Thompson, the impact was often enough to knock him off his feet, ending his ability to resist instantly. This one-shot stop capability turned the Thompson into a weapon of psychological erasure. The German infantryman knew that if he met a Thompson gunner in a hallway, there would be no fair trade of fire. He would be stopped dead in his tracks before his brain could even process the impact. "We were clearing a cellar in the center of Aachen," recalled a survivor of a Sturmabteilung. "We heard the metallic shock of a bolt. My comrade pushed through the doorway with his MP40, but he was met with a storm. It wasn't like the Russian submachine guns, which hummed like sewing machines. The Thompson roared. My friend was thrown backwards as if he had been kicked by a horse. There was no time to aim, no time to scream. The Americans simply hose-washed the entrance with lead. We realized then that the spirit of our training meant nothing against a weapon that simply threw so much heavy lead that the air itself felt solid." This hose-washing technique was a direct, violent violation of everything the German infantrymen had been taught about the honor of the shot. German marksmanship was a point of pride, even in the chaos of urban combat. But the Thompson gunner practiced area saturation. Because the weapon was so heavy and its recoil was a steady backward push rather than a sharp snap, a GI could sweep a room from left to right in a single continuous burst. In the stone hell, this was the ultimate tactical advantage. The Thompson gunner didn't need to see his target. He only needed to know which room the target was in and then hose the space until nothing moved. The Germans began to describe the Thompson as the industrial broom. It was a weapon that felt like an extension of the American factory line, unrelenting, heavy, and seemingly impossible to exhaust. This led to a specific tactical paralysis known among German NCOs as Thompson shock. If a German squad knew that an American assault team with Thompsons was in the building, they would often refuse to enter the stairwells. They would wait for the building to be leveled by artillery because they knew that in the shadows of the hallways, the Thompson gunner was the apex predator. As the battle for the German border cities reached its crescendo, the Wehrmacht realized that the Thompson was not just a defensive tool, it was the core of a new, aggressive urban doctrine. American squads had perfected the diamond or Y formation for street clearing, a tactic that turned a four-man team into a mobile 360-degree fortress of lead. In this formation, the lead man, the point, was almost always armed with a Thompson. His job was not to aim for precision, but to suppress the angle. To the German defenders hiding in doorways, this was a terrifying evolution. They were used to a war where you could wait for the enemy to stop and aim before you fired. But the Thompson-led diamond didn't stop. The lead gunner would sweep his weapon in a continuous arc, hosing down every window and doorway as the team moved at a steady walking pace. This mobile wall of fire meant that by the time a German soldier gathered the courage to peek around a corner, he was already being suppressed by a .45 caliber storm. It created a feeling of being mechanically hunted by an opponent that never needed to pause to find its mark. This dread reached its zenith during the assault on the Siegfried Line, the West Wall. Here, the fighting moved from the streets into the cold, claustrophobic concrete of subterranean bunkers. In these narrow, echoing corridors, the Thompson became an instrument of pure nightmare. German soldiers recorded a specific horror regarding the .45 ACP round's performance in concrete environments. Because the slug was heavy, made of soft lead, and relatively slow, it didn't always shatter on impact like higher-velocity rifle rounds. Instead, it had a terrifying tendency to ricochet off the reinforced concrete walls, turning a single burst into a lethal, unpredictable geometric trap. The tunnels were filled with the sound of 1,000 hammers, one survivor of the Aachen bunkers wrote. The Americans didn't even enter the rooms. They would simply thrust the barrel of the Thompson around the steel door and fire a full magazine. The bullets would bounce off the floors and the ceilings. You weren't just dodging the gunner, you were dodging the room itself. There was no bravery possible in those tunnels. There was only the sound of the metal hitting the walls until everyone inside was silent. This led to the phenomenon of stairwell dread. In European urban architecture, the staircase was the ultimate choke point. German doctrine called for the defense of the upper ground, assuming that a few men with rifles could hold a staircase against a company. But the Thompson negated the geometry of the vertical defense. Because the weapon was short and lacked the long barrel of the K98K, a GI could lead with his weapon while staying almost entirely behind the cover of the banister. He could pre-fire the landing before his head ever crested the floor level. The German defenders, struggling to swing their long rifles in the tight turns of the stairwell, found themselves outmatched before they even saw a face. The Thompson was simply too fast and too violent for the 19th century architecture of the German fatherland. It turned their own homes into death traps. As the final pockets of resistance in the German frontier cities were systematically silenced, the Wehrmacht High Command was forced to face a bitter strategic reality. The war of the soldier, which they believed they could win through superior discipline and the fanatical defense of their homes, had been transformed into a war of the machine. The Thompson Submachine Gun, once dismissed by Nazi propaganda as a weapon of American criminality, had emerged as the ultimate arbiter of urban survival. For the German infantrymen, the Thompson didn't just win firefights, it fundamentally dismantled the German concept of the fortress city. The outcome of the battles for Aachen, Metz, and the Siegfried Line revealed a catastrophic failure in German tactical adaptation. Their doctrine had relied on the assumption that an urban environment would slow the war down, favoring the defenders' patience and precision. But the Thompson accelerated the pace of combat to a point where the German defender was perpetually behind the decision-making cycle. By the time a grenadier could identify a threat, the .45 caliber storm had already reached him. The stopping power that the Germans so feared was not just physical, it was a tactical freeze that prevented them from launching the counterattacks their doctrine demanded. In the cold analysis of late 1944, German officers began to acknowledge the logistical terror that the Thompson represented. While the German army struggled to produce even the simplified MP-3008 in the war's final months, the Americans were flooded with Thompsons and M1 Garands. The sight of an American squad clearing a building, using ammunition as if it were an infinite disposable resource, shattered the Wehrmacht's belief in their own material superiority. The Thompson was the sound of a civilization that could afford to waste thousands of rounds to secure a single hallway. For the German soldier, every death rattle was a reminder that he was being outproduced by a factory worker thousands of miles away. This realization led to a profound shift in the German soldier's psychology. They began to view urban combat not as a heroic defense, but as a mechanical slaughter. The Stairwell Dread and the Ricochet Trap were not obstacles to be overcome by bravery. They were death sentences issued by a weapon that didn't care for the warrior soul. The Thompson had automated the clearing of their cities, turning the stone hell into a clinical, industrial process of erasure. They had started the war believing that the soldier's spirit was the final word in combat. They ended it in the rubble, realizing that the final word was spoken by the heavy, rhythmic cycling of an American bolt.